In the heart of Nebraska's farm country, a story of fate and redemption is about to unfold. When the worst storm in 50 years tears through Miller County, Thomas Wheeler thinks he's just doing what any farmer would do, saving a stranger from certain death. He couldn't be more wrong. The young woman he pulls from the rising waters of Carter Creek isn't just another traveler caught in the storm. She's Sarah Harrison, sole heir to the 200 acres of prime farmland that Thomas has dreamed of. Owning his entire life, the land that could finally make his family's legacy complete, the land that now stands between him and everything he's ever wanted. What happens when the person standing in the way of your dreams becomes the dream itself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Wheeler's mornings always began the same way, long before the sun thought about rising. That morning was no different, despite the previous night's drama still clinging to his clothes like the musty scent of rain-soaked earth. His weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug as he stood at his kitchen window, watching the storm's aftermath paint the horizon in watercolor shades of gray and purple. The old deed to the Wheeler family farm hung on the wall behind him, its frame wearing 40 years of dust like a badge of honor. His father had placed it there the day they paid off the last mortgage, and Thomas had never moved it. The yellow paper inside had faded to the color of wheat ready for harvest, but the words remained clear. Wheeler Family Holdings. Established. 1952. Below that, his father's signature looked as bold as the day he'd signed it. From where he stood, Thomas could see clear across to the Harrison property. Those 200 acres of prime soil had been calling to him for years, whispering promises of expansion and prosperity. Old man Harrison had been a good neighbor, always willing to lend a hand during harvest or share equipment when needed. They'd talked about Thomas buying the land someday, casual conversations over fence posts and shared beers that felt more like promises than possibilities. But Harrison's sudden passing 6 months ago had changed everything. Thomas set his coffee down and pulled out his father's ledger from the kitchen drawer. The pages were worn soft at the corners, filled with neat columns of numbers and notes spanning decades. His father had taught him that farming wasn't just about working the land, it was about planning, about understanding the rhythm of seasons and markets. They'd been setting aside money for years, preparing for the day the Harrison land might come available. "You've got to think ahead," his father always said. "A good farmer plans for the harvest before the first seed touches soil," the ledger told. A story of careful management and patient growth. Thomas had added his own entries over the years, watching the savings grow slowly but steadily. It was almost enough now, almost enough to make a fair offer on the Harrison land. Almost enough to fulfill the dream that had driven 3 generations of Wheelers. Outside, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across fields still puddled from the storm. Thomas thought about the young woman sleeping in his guest room upstairs, Sarah Harrison. The name had hit him like a physical blow when she'd told him, half conscious and shivering, as he'd helped her from her flooded car. He'd known Harrison had a granddaughter somewhere out east, but she'd always been abstract, a distant figure mentioned in passing conversations. Now she was here, flesh and blood, sleeping under his roof. And with her arrival, everything he'd planned, everything he'd worked for, suddenly felt as uncertain as Nebraska weather. Thomas pulled on his boots and headed out to check the damage from last night's storm. The morning air was clean and cool, carrying the sharp scent of wet earth and new growth. His boots left deep impressions in the mud as he walked the property line between his land and what could have been, his future. The old fence marking the boundary needed work. A few posts had shifted in the soft ground, and one section had collapsed entirely under the weight of storm debris. Thomas ran his hand along the weathered wood, remembering all the times he'd stood here with old man Harrison, talking about crops and weather and the future. "This land," Harrison had said once, "it's got good bones, deep soil, the kind that grows more than just crops. It grows legacy." Legacy. The word echoed in Thomas's mind as he began clearing debris from the fallen fence. The Wheelers had been building their legacy in this soil for 3 generations. His grandfather had started with nothing but determination and a handful of acres. His father had expanded, modernized, turned the farm into something that could support a family and survive the lean years. And Thomas had dreams of taking it further, building something his own children could inherit with pride. But now those dreams were complicated by the presence of a young woman who probably knew nothing about farming, nothing about the decades of history soaked into this soil. Sarah Harrison might own the deed to that land, but did she understand what it meant? Could she appreciate the weight of responsibility that came with 200 acres of prime Nebraska farmland? Thomas straightened up, his back protesting the morning's work. The sun was fully up now, turning the wet fields into mirrors that reflected the sky. In a few hours, Sarah would wake up, and they'd have to figure out where to go from here. But for now, Thomas did what farmers had always done. He worked the land in front of him and tried not to worry too much about tomorrow. The floorboards above Thomas's head creaked with unfamiliar footsteps. He'd just finished making a fresh pot of coffee when Sarah Harrison appeared in his kitchen doorway, wrapped in the old quilt his mother had made years ago. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her designer clothes from the night before replaced with an oversized flannel shirt and jeans he'd managed to find in his sister's old room. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice still carrying traces of sleep. "I smelled coffee." Thomas gestured to the pot. "Help yourself. Mugs are in the cabinet to your left." She moved with the careful uncertainty of someone in an unfamiliar space, but there was something graceful about her, even in borrowed clothes. As she poured her coffee, Thomas noticed a folder tucked under her arm, the same one she'd insisted on retrieving from her waterlogged car the night before. Even as the storm raged around them, "I wanted to thank you properly," Sarah said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "For last night, I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." "Anyone would have done the same," Thomas cut in, uncomfortable with gratitude for what had seemed like simple necessity. Sarah smiled, a warm expression that reached her eyes. "Maybe, but it was you who did." She placed her folder on the table, running her fingers along its edge. "I suppose I should explain why I was out here in the first place." Thomas's heart skipped a beat as she opened the folder. Inside were papers he recognized instantly. Property deeds, legal documents, the kind of paperwork that changed lives. Sarah spread them out carefully, handling them with a reverence that surprised him. "My grandfather, James Harrison. He passed away 6 months ago." "I know," Thomas said quietly. "He was a good man, a good neighbor." Sarah nodded, blinking rapidly. "I didn't know him as well as I should have. My parents, well, they had different dreams for me than farming in Nebraska. But when he died," she pulled out a particular document, its official letterhead stark against the wooden table. "He left everything to me, the land, the old house, everything." Thomas stared at his coffee, trying to keep his expression neutral even as his dreams seemed to crumble around him. "Your grandfather, he and I had talked about the sale," Sarah finished. "Yes, I found his notes about that, about you." She paused, studying him. "He wrote quite a bit about the Wheelers, actually, about how you've helped maintain the property these past few years, about your plans for expansion." Hope flickered briefly in Thomas's chest before he squashed it down. "Those were just conversations, nothing formal, but they meant something to him." Sarah pulled out another paper, this one covered in her grandfather's familiar scrawl. "He wrote that he couldn't think of better hands for the land to end up in, but then he got sick so quickly." The kitchen fell silent, except for the gentle ticking of the old clock on the wall. Outside, a tractor rumbled to life somewhere in the distance, the sound carrying clearly through the morning air. "I came out here to see it for myself," Sarah continued, "to understand why this land was so important to him. Important enough that She trailed off, emotion catching in her throat. Thomas found himself wanting to reach across the table to offer comfort to this stranger who carried the weight of Harrison's legacy in a manila folder. Instead, he stood up and walked to the window. "Would you like to see it?" he asked. "The land, I mean. Really see it, not just from a car window in the rain." Sarah's face brightened. "I'd like that, though I should warn you. I don't know the first thing about farming. The closest I've come is the herb garden on my apartment balcony in Chicago." For the first time since discovering her identity, Thomas felt the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "Well, you're in luck. I happen to be a pretty good teacher when it comes to farming." She gathered the papers back into their folder, handling them with the same care his father had shown for the old deed on the wall. "Mr. Wheeler. Thomas," he corrected. "Thomas," she amended. "I don't know what I'm going to do with this land, but I'd like to understand it first, to understand what my grandfather saw in it. Would you help me with that?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibilities neither of them could fully see. Thomas looked at Sarah Harrison, really looked at her, and saw something unexpected, a genuineness, a desire to honor her grandfather's memory, even if she didn't quite know how. "I can do that," he said finally. "But first, you should probably know what you're getting yourself into. Around here, morning starts before dawn, and the work doesn't care if you're wearing designer jeans." Sarah's laugh, bright and unexpected, filled the kitchen. "Well then, I guess it's a good thing I borrowed these clothes. Shall we start with Lesson 1? Miller County's only diner sat at the intersection of Route 27 and Old Mill Road, a weathered building that had served as the community's unofficial meeting hall for the past 4 decades. Thomas hadn't planned on bringing Sarah here so soon, but his friend Mike's voice over the phone that morning had left little room for argument. "Word travels fast," Thomas explained as he held the door open for her, "especially when someone pulls a car out of Carter Creek in the middle of a storm." The bell above the door chimed their arrival, and the usual morning chatter died down to a curious hush. Every head turned to study Sarah, who straightened her spine, but couldn't quite hide her discomfort at the attention. "Well, if it isn't our local hero," Mike called from behind the counter, his weathered face creasing into a warm smile. "And this must be the city girl everyone's talking about." The community bulletin board behind Mike's counter told the story of their farming community in paper and pushpins. Weather warnings competed for space with equipment sale notices and handwritten advertisements for seasonal help. A faded photo of old man Harrison still hung in one corner, taken at last year's county fair, where his corn had won first prize for the 3rd year running. "Sarah Harrison," she introduced herself, extending her hand to Mike, "and apparently I owe your community a debt of gratitude for last night." Something in her grace under scrutiny seemed to thaw the initial reserve in the room. Conversations gradually resumed, though Thomas noticed more than a few glances in their direction as Mike led them to a booth by the window. "Your grandfather was a regular here," Mike said, pouring coffee without asking. "Always said no serious farming business should be conducted without at least 2 cups of coffee and a slice of Marie's apple pie." Sarah's eyes drifted to her grandfather's photo. "I'm learning he had a lot of wisdom to share." "That he did." Mike's expression grew thoughtful. "You know, we've got his usual order memorized if you'd like to. Black coffee and apple pie?" Sarah smiled. "Yes, please." Thomas watched the exchange with growing interest. She was handling herself well, better than he'd expected. As Mike walked away, he nodded toward the bulletin board. "That board's been the heart of local farming news since before I was born. Every major sale, every weather warning, every celebration. It all goes up there first." Sarah studied the notices intently. "There's so much coordination involved. I had no idea farmers worked this closely together. We have to. Good farming isn't just about your own land, it's about understanding what's happening across the whole county. Weather doesn't respect property lines. A group of farmers at the next table had gone conspicuously quiet, clearly listening to their conversation. Thomas recognized the Hendersons and old Bill Cooper, men who'd worked alongside his father for years. "Miss Harrison," Bill finally called over, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came with 50 years of farming experience. "Pardon the interruption, but we're all wondering, what are your plans for your grandfather's land?" The diner grew quiet again. Thomas felt his shoulders tense, but Sarah met Bill's gaze steadily. "Honestly, Mr. Cooper, I'm still learning. This morning, Thomas showed me how to check soil composition. Yesterday, I couldn't have told you why that mattered, but my grandfather loved this land, and I owe it to his memory to understand why before I make any decisions." Bill's weathered face remained impassive for a moment before cracking into a slight smile. "James always said education was the best fertilizer for growing good sense. Didn't he, Thomas?" The tension in the room eased, replaced by scattered chuckles. "Of agreement." Mike returned with the pie, and conversation gradually shifted to the previous night's storm damage and predictions for the spring planting season. Thomas watched as Sarah naturally fell into discussion with the Hendersons about their daughter, who also lived in Chicago. She was a quick study, not just about farming, but about people. She listened more than she spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and showed genuine interest in the answers. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, catching the dust motes in golden light. On the bulletin board, a new notice about the upcoming seed exchange fair fluttered in the breeze from the old ceiling fan. Thomas found himself imagining Sarah there, not as an outsider, but as part of the community, understanding the rhythm of seasons and sales that governed their lives. "Your father would have liked her," Mike said quietly, refilling Thomas's coffee cup. "She's got that same look he always talked about. The one that says the land matters more than the profit." Thomas nodded, unable to form a response, as he watched Sarah laugh at one of Bill Cooper's notorious tractor repair stories. She caught his eye across the diner and smiled, a quick, private gesture that suggested she was exactly where she wanted to be. For the first time since the storm, Thomas allowed himself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, dreams could change shape without breaking. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Harrison farmhouse's study as Sarah pulled another dusty box from the closet. She'd been at it for hours, sorting through her grandfather's belongings with a determination that both surprised and impressed Thomas, who'd stopped by to check on her after finishing his afternoon rounds. "I found something," she called out, her voice muffled by dust. Yes, this is it." She emerged from the closet holding a leather-bound journal, its pages swollen with decades of use and extra notes tucked between the covers. Thomas recognized it immediately. James Harrison's farming journal, as much a part of the man as his favorite hat or his ancient pickup truck. "He wrote in this every day," Thomas said softly, accepting the journal when Sarah handed it to him. "Weather, patterns, soil conditions, crop rotations, everything that mattered went in here." Sarah settled cross-legged on the floor beside him, brushing dust from her jeans. "Show me how to read it. I mean, really read it. I can see it's important, but—" Thomas opened the journal carefully, its leather creaking with familiar age. "Here, see these numbers? That's his code for soil pH levels. And these symbols next to the dates, they're his personal weather markers. A circle meant clear skies, a half circle meant partial clouds. Like this one?" Sarah pointed to a page, her finger tracing a series of notations. "Exactly. You're catching on quick." She smiled, but her eyes remained focused on the journal. "It's like learning a new language. Yesterday you showed me how to test soil composition, and now I'm seeing his notes about it here. It's all connected, isn't it?" Thomas nodded, turning another page. "Farming is about patterns. Your grandfather understood that better than most. Look here. See how he tracked the rainfall against the crop yields. He could predict almost to the day when each field would be ready for harvest. They spent the next hour poring over the journal, Sarah asking increasingly detailed questions that revealed her growing understanding. Thomas found himself forgetting to maintain his professional distance as they debated the merits of different irrigation techniques documented in the aging pages. "What about this section?" Sarah asked, pointing to a dog-eared page near the back. "The writing's different here." Thomas recognized the passage. He'd been there the day Harrison wrote it, just a few months before his death. He was talking about the future, about changes he wanted to make to the eastern fields. Sarah leaned closer, her shoulder brushing against his as she read. "The Wheeler boy understands the land," she read aloud, "and sees it the way I do, not just as soil and crops, but as a living thing that needs care and respect." She paused, glancing at Thomas. "He wrote a lot about you." Thomas stood abruptly, uncomfortable with the praise from beyond the grave. "Your grandfather was generous with his good opinion." "No," Sarah said firmly, rising to face him. "He was honest. I've seen how you work, Thomas. These past few days, watching you, you don't just farm the land. You listen to it. Every decision you make comes from understanding what it needs." Her insight, so close to what Harrison himself used to say, caught Thomas off guard. He turned to look out the study window, where the last light of day painted the fields in gold and shadow. "You're beginning to understand it too," he said finally. "I've seen you out there at dawn, walking the fields before anyone else is up. You're learning to read the signs." Sarah joined him at the window, the journal hugged close to her chest. "I never expected to feel this way about farming. Back in Chicago, my whole life was about quarterly reports and client meetings. But here," she gestured to the sprawling fields, "here, everything feels real in a way I can't quite explain." "You don't have to explain it," Thomas said softly. "Either you feel it or you don't." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the sun sink lower. The journal in Sarah's arms contained decades of farming wisdom, but Thomas realized she was adding her own understanding to that legacy, seeing the land through eyes that combined her grandfather's instincts with her own fresh perspective. "Would you teach me more?" she asked suddenly. "Not just the basics, but everything. How to really work the land, how to make the decisions that matter." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the city girl who'd arrived in a storm, but someone who might actually understand what this land meant. It was dangerous, this shift in how he saw her, but he couldn't help himself. "On one condition," he said. "You have to be sure. This isn't something you learn halfway." Sarah's response was to open the journal to a blank page near the back. She found a pen on her grandfather's desk and wrote the date at the top, then looked up at Thomas with a challenge in her eyes. "Teach me about tomorrow's weather patterns. I want to start my own records." And just like that, Thomas knew he was in trouble. Because teaching Sarah Harrison about farming meant spending more time with her, and spending more time with her meant, well, that was something he wasn't quite ready to think about yet. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by courier rather than their usual mail carrier. Sarah was checking fence posts with Thomas when the sleek black car pulled up to the Harrison mailbox, looking as out of place as a tuxedo at a barn raising. "Miss Harrison?" The courier's crisp voice carried across the field. "Package from Meridian Development Corporation." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He knew that name. Everyone in 3 counties knew it. Meridian had been buying up farms across the state, turning generations of agricultural heritage into shopping centers and housing developments. Sarah wiped her hands on her jeans, no longer borrowed clothes, but her own well-worn work pants now, and walked over to sign for the package. Thomas watched her expression change as she opened the heavy envelope, her face shifting from curiosity to surprise. "They want to buy the land," she said quietly, walking back to where Thomas stood. "All of it. The house, the fields, everything. She handed him a glossy presentation folder, its pages filled with architectural renderings and projected revenue charts. Sunrise Plaza, Thomas read from the cover, his voice flat. A mixed-use development featuring premium retail space and luxury apartments. The proposed purchase price at the bottom of the page made his breath catch. It was nearly triple what the land was worth as farmland. Sarah spread the documents across the hood of his truck. Look at all this. They've got everything planned. Outdoor shopping centers, restaurants, a movie theater. They say it'll bring jobs to the area, increase property values, and pave over some of the best farming soil in the state, Thomas added, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. He picked up the formal offer letter, its corporate letterhead stark and imposing. They're giving you 2 weeks to decide. No. Sarah ran her fingers over the architectural drawings. It's a lot of money, Thomas. He turned away, focusing on the fields stretching out before them. The winter wheat was just starting to show, tiny green shoots reaching for the spring. Sunshine. In a few months those shoots would be waist-high, dancing in the Nebraska wind like waves on a green ocean. You're thinking about my offer, he said finally, the one I was going to make before you pulled me out of a flooding creek. There was a gentle teasing in her voice, but her eyes were serious. Yes, I'm thinking about it. About everything. Thomas forced himself to look at her. I can't match their price, not even close. I know that too. Sarah folded the papers back into their envelope. But maybe this isn't just about money, isn't it? The words came out sharper than he intended. That's prime development land they're offering to buy, the kind of offer that could set you up for life back in Chicago. No more dawn wake-ups, no more worrying about rainfall or crop prices. Sarah stepped closer, her expression hardening. Is that what you think I want to run back to Chicago? I think. Thomas stopped, realizing he was dangerously close to saying things he couldn't take back. I think you need to consider all your options carefully, like you did. Sarah's voice was quiet but intense. When you spent years saving to buy this land, when you worked beside my grandfather, learning everything he could teach you, were you just considering your options then? The afternoon sun caught the gold flecks in her eyes, making them shine with something that looked like hurt. Thomas suddenly realized how close they were standing, how he could smell the lavender shampoo she used despite the day's work in the fields. Sarah, Ms. Harrison? The courier's voice cut through the moment. I need a preliminary response. For my records. Should I tell Meridian you'll be reviewing their offer? Sarah held Thomas's gaze for a long moment before turning back to the courier. Yes, I'll review it. They'll have my answer within their time frame. As the black car pulled away, raising a cloud of dust on the dirt road, Sarah picked up the folder. Of development plans. You know what the strange thing is. A month ago, this would have seemed like the simplest decision in the world. Good money, clean break, back to my old life. And now, she looked out over the fields, at the tiny green shoots they'd been watching grow together. Now I understand what my grandfather meant when he said some things are worth more than money. I just wish... What? I wish I knew if I was strong enough to believe that too. Thomas watched her walk back to the Harrison house, the development plans tucked under her arm like a weight she wasn't sure she wanted to carry. He'd spent years dreaming of owning that land, but now, watching Sarah wrestle with the decision that would shape both their futures, he realized his dream had somehow shifted without his permission. The question was no longer about owning the land, it was about who he wanted to work it with. Dawn painted the sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold as Thomas pulled up to the Harrison farm. Sarah was already outside, her grandfather's seed catalog spread across the tailgate of her newly purchased used pickup truck. She'd traded in her flood-damaged car 2 weeks ago, saying something about how you couldn't haul feed in a BMW. You're late, she called out without looking up, a hint of teasing in her voice. Sun's been up for at least 2 minutes. Thomas smiled despite himself, walking over to see what had her so absorbed. The catalogue was dog-eared and marked with both her neat handwriting and her grandfather's familiar scrawl. Between them, they'd covered nearly every page with notes about soil, types, planting depths, and yield predictions. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, pointing to a particularly marked-up page. "Grandfather's notes show he always planted the north field in corn, but look at these soil samples we took last week. What if we tried that new drought-resistant wheat variety instead?" Thomas leaned in, their shoulders touching as he studied the data. Her hair smelled of morning air and coffee, and he forced himself to focus on the numbers. "The pH levels would support it," he admitted. "But it's a risk. That variety's still pretty new." "Sometimes risk is good," she said softly. And Thomas wasn't sure they were still talking about wheat. The Meridian development offer sat unopened in Sarah's kitchen, 11 days into their 14-day deadline. Neither of them had mentioned it since it arrived, but its presence hung between them like storm clouds on the horizon. "Here," Sarah said, pulling out a detailed planting schedule she'd created. "I cross-referenced grandfather's journal entries with the current almanac predictions. If we start today, we can have both properties planted before the next rain system moves in." Her plan was good. Better than good, actually. She'd thought of things even Thomas might have missed, like rotating the heavy equipment between fields to minimize soil compaction. 2 months of intensive study had turned her into something more than just an eager student. They worked through the morning, the steady pulse of the planter, marking time as they moved across the fields. Sarah drove the tractor like she'd been born to it, maintaining perfectly straight lines as she followed the GPS guidance system. Thomas found himself watching her more than the seedbed, noticing how naturally she fit into this life she'd never planned for. During their lunch break, sitting in the shade of an old oak tree, Sarah pulled out a sandwich and the latest soil analysis reports. "You know what's funny?" she said, spreading the papers between them. "In Chicago, I used to spend my lunch breaks looking at market projections and investment portfolios. Now I'm excited about nitrogen levels and germination rates. Having second thoughts?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Sarah looked up, meeting his eyes with a directness that made his heart skip. "Actually, I'm having first thoughts. Real ones. Back in Chicago, everything was abstract. Numbers on a screen, theoretical outcomes. Here," she gestured to the fields around them. "Here, I can see the results of every decision. I can literally watch things grow." A comfortable silence fell between them as they ate, broken only by the distant call of meadowlarks and the rustle of wind through emerging crops. Sarah had marked up the soil reports with the same attention to detail she'd shown with the seed catalogue, adding her own observations to the technical data. "We should get back to it," Thomas said, finally gathering their lunch things. "Those seeds won't plant themselves." Sarah stood, brushing dirt from her jeans. "You know, my business friends in Chicago think I've lost my mind. Trading designer suits for work boots, board meetings for soil testing." "Have you?" Thomas asked, suddenly serious. "Lost your mind?" She looked out over the fields they'd spent, the morning planting, at the rich, dark soil holding the promise of another season's growth. "No," she said thoughtfully. "I think maybe I've finally found something real, something that matters." The afternoon passed in a rhythm as old as farming itself, the steady movement across the fields, the careful monitoring of seed depth and spacing, the quiet satisfaction of seeing rows of prepared soil behind them. They worked together with an ease that felt both natural and surprising, anticipating each other's needs without having to speak. As the sun began to set, painting the newly planted fields in shades of amber and gold, Sarah made one final pass with the tractor. Thomas watched her silhouette against the darkening sky, remembering another sunset not so long ago when he'd thought his dreams of this land were ending. Now, watching Sarah bring the tractor in with the confidence of a born farmer, he realized those dreams hadn't ended. They'd just changed into something he'd never expected. The development company's deadline was 3 days away, but looking at Sarah's face, glowing with the satisfaction of a day's good work, Thomas had a feeling he already knew what her answer would be. Some dreams, it turned out, were worth more than money could buy. The Mercedes SUV looked almost comical, parked next to Sarah's weathered farm truck, its pristine white paint job practically glowing in the afternoon sun. Thomas watched from the edge of the cornfield as Sarah's parents emerged from the vehicle, their designer clothes and careful movements broadcasting their discomfort with the rural setting. "Darling, you look so rustic," Sarah's mother managed, air-kissing her daughters' cheeks while trying to avoid actually touching Sarah's work clothes. Her father was already on his phone, pacing the gravel driveway as he barked instructions to someone about market futures. Sarah caught Thomas's eye across the yard and gave him a small shrug that managed to convey both apology and resignation. He'd offered to make himself scarce during her family's visit, but she'd insisted he stay. "I want them to see what I'm doing here," she'd said that morning. "Really see it." "Sarah, honey," her mother was saying, pulling a leather-bound album. From her designer bag, "I brought some photos to remind you of home, of who you really are." They settled on the porch, the album open between them. Thomas couldn't help but notice how the pictures showed a different Sarah, elegantly dressed, perfectly coiffed, standing in front of gleaming skyscrapers and exclusive restaurants. But to his eyes, that Sarah looked somehow less real than the woman who now spent her days working the land beside him. "Look at you at the Thompson benefit," her mother sighed, pointing to a photo of Sarah in an evening gown. "Remember Charles Thompson? He still asks about you. His investment firm is doing remarkably well, Mom," Sarah interrupted gently. "I'm not interested in Charles Thompson, or benefits, or investment firms." Her father finally pocketed his phone, joining them on the porch. "Speaking of investments, Sarah, we need to discuss this development offer. The Meridian people contacted me. It's an incredible opportunity. We could triple your grandfather's investment in this property." Thomas tensed, but kept his attention on the irrigation system he was pretending to check. "I've made my decision about that," Sarah said quietly but firmly. "I'm not selling." "Don't be ridiculous," her father snapped. "This isn't you, Sarah, playing farmer, getting your hands dirty. The Sarah in these photos would never—" "The Sarah in these photos was suffocating," she cut in, her voice stronger now. "She was playing a role she thought she had to play. This—" She gestured to the fields around them, to her dirt-stained jeans and calloused hands. "This is real. This matters." Her mother closed the photo album with a sharp snap. "Darling, you're not thinking clearly. All this fresh air and physical labor, it's clouding your judgment. Think about your future." "I am thinking about my future." Sarah stood up, walking to the porch railing. "Come look at this." Reluctantly, her parents joined her. The late afternoon sun painted the fields in gold, highlighting the neat rows of emerging crops stretching to the horizon. In the distance, the irrigation system Thomas had been checking sent sparkles of water into the air like diamonds. "Grandfather built this," Sarah said softly. "Not just the farm. He built something that matters, something that feeds people, that carries on through generations. I feel him here in every acre, every decision. And now I'm learning to build something too." "With him?" her father asked sharply, jerking his head toward Thomas. Sarah's voice remained calm. "Yes, with Thomas. He's teaching me things, Grandfather. Would have taught me if I'd been wise enough to learn sooner." "But your career," her mother started. "This is my career now." Sarah picked up the photo album, running her hand over its expensive leather cover. "These pictures, they show someone who looked perfect on the outside, but felt empty inside. I don't feel empty anymore." Thomas focused intently on a non-existent problem with the irrigation controls, his heart pounding at the quiet conviction in Sarah's voice. "The deadline for the development offer is tomorrow," her father said, his tone hard. "Don't throw away everything you've worked for." Sarah smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. I'm not throwing anything away, Dad. I'm building something real, something that would make Grandfather proud. The sun was setting by the time the Mercedes pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust on the gravel drive. Sarah stood watching until the car disappeared, then turned to find Thomas beside her. "You okay?" he asked softly. She looked at the photo album still in her hands, then out at the darkening fields where their newly planted crops were just beginning to emerge. "You know what, I really am." And standing there in the gathering dusk, Thomas realized she'd never looked less like the polished woman in those photos, and never looked more beautiful. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as Thomas and Sarah stood at the edge of the eastern field, watching their wheat leaves curl in the relentless heat. 37 days without rain had turned the Nebraska sky into a blank canvas of blue, beautiful but deadly to their struggling crops. "The irrigation system can't keep up," Sarah said, crumbling a handful of dry soil between her fingers. "We're losing too much to evaporation, even running it at night," Thomas nodded grimly. They'd been fighting this battle for weeks now, watching the weather reports with increasing desperation as each promised storm system dissipated before reaching their parched fields. He followed Sarah back to the Harrison house, where she spread out her grandfather's old irrigation plans across the kitchen table. The papers were yellowed with age, covered in James Harrison's meticulous notes about water flow rates and field gradients. Sarah had added her own notes in the margins, calculations and ideas that showed how thoroughly she'd absorbed the technical side of farming. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a section of the plans. Grandfather had an idea for a supplemental irrigation system, but he never implemented it. "See how he mapped out the aquifer access points?" Thomas leaned closer, their shoulders touching as they studied the plans. "It would take a lot of work to put in, and money. We have to do something." Sarah's voice held a note of steel he'd come to recognize. "These crops, they're not just plants, Thomas, they're our future." The word "our" hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was quite ready to address. Instead, Thomas focused on the technical challenge, tracing the proposed irrigation lines with his finger. "Even if we work around the clock, it'll take at least a week to install. The crops might not have that long." Sarah straightened up, determination written across her features. "Then we'd better get started. I'll call Mike and the Hendersons, see who can lend us equipment." By sunset, word had spread through the farming community. Trucks began arriving at the Harrison farm, carrying tools, pipes, and neighbors ready to help. Mike brought his backhoe, Bill Cooper arrived with his sons and their trenching equipment, and even the Hendersons' teenage boys showed up with shovels and willing hands. They worked through the night under portable floodlights, taking advantage of the cooler hours. Sarah moved between groups of workers, coordinating efforts with a natural authority that made Thomas's heart swell with pride. She knew everyone's names now, understood their strengths, and deployed them with the same careful attention she once used to manage corporate teams. Around midnight, Thomas found her sitting on the tailgate of her truck, studying the irrigation plans by flashlight. A smudge of dirt marked her cheek, and her hair had long since escaped its ponytail, but her eyes were bright with focused energy. "You should get some rest," he said, sitting beside her. "So should you." She smiled tiredly. "But we both know that's not happening." Their shoulders brushed as they sat in comfortable silence, watching the bobbing beams of flashlights, marking where teams continued working across the darkened fields. The night air carried the smell of newly turned earth and the distant rumble of machinery. "You know," Sarah said softly, "when I first came here, I thought farming was just about following a schedule. Plant the seeds, water them, harvest what grows. But it's not that simple, is it?" "No," Thomas agreed. "It's about fighting for what matters, about not giving up when things get hard." Sarah turned to look at him, her face half illuminated by the flashlight's glow. "Is that what we're doing, Thomas? Fighting for what matters?" The question carried more weight than just their current battle against the drought. Thomas felt the warmth of her shoulder against his, saw the trust and something deeper in her eyes, and knew he couldn't keep pretending his feelings were simply those of a farming mentor. But before he could respond, Mike's voice called out from the darkness, "Hey! We've hit the aquifer line!" Sarah jumped up the moment broken. "Coming!" She turned back to Thomas, holding out her hand, ready to keep fighting. He took her hand, letting her pull him up, and if their fingers remained entwined a moment longer than necessary, neither of them mentioned it. They had crops to save after all. But as they walked together toward the waiting work, Thomas realized that somewhere between teaching Sarah about farming and watching her fight for this land, his heart had started to believe in new possibilities. The first rays of sunlight caught the morning dew on the wheat field, making it sparkle like a sea of gold. Sarah stood at the edge of the field, running her hand along the heavy heads of grain, feeling their weight, the weight of a season's worth of work, worry, and hope. "Ready?" Thomas's voice came from behind her. She turned to see him approaching, with 2 travel mugs of coffee, steam rising in the cool morning air. "Almost can't believe we made it," she said, accepting one of the mugs. "After that drought, but we did make it." He gestured to where the combine harvester waited, massive and ready. "And the grain moisture meter readings are perfect. Today's the day." They worked in synchronized harmony, the result of months spent learning each other's rhythms. Sarah handled the combine like she'd been born to it, maintaining perfect rows, while Thomas coordinated the grain trucks. Their efforts during the drought had paid off. The yield was looking even better than they'd hoped. By mid-morning, the first trucks were heading to the grain elevator in town. Sarah insisted on driving one herself, following Thomas's truck down the familiar road. The queue at the elevator was long, a good sign, meaning everyone was having a successful harvest. But Sarah didn't mind the wait. Each farmer who arrived nodded in recognition, several stopping to chat about yield rates and grain prices. She found herself easily joining conversations that would have been incomprehensible to her just months ago. When they finally reached the front of the line, the elevator operator, Bob Mitchell, gave Sarah a respectful nod. "Ms. Harrison, heard you and Wheeler pulled through that drought pretty well." "We had help," Sarah said, thinking of the community's response during their irrigation crisis. "Good neighbors make all the difference." Bob ran their wheat through the quality tests, his eyebrows rising slightly at the results. "Premium grade," he announced. "Best numbers I've seen all day." The sales receipt he handed them showed a figure that made Sarah's breath catch, not just for the amount, but for what it represented. There at the top, printed in clear black letters, Wheeler Harrison Farms. Thomas had been using the joint name for their operation for weeks now, ever since they'd started coordinating their harvests, but seeing it officially documented made it feel real in a new way. She caught him watching her reaction and smiled, carefully folding the receipt and tucking it into her shirt pocket. They celebrated that evening at Mike's diner, along with other farmers who'd finished their harvest. The usual dinner crowd had pushed tables together to make room for everyone, and Marie had outdone herself with a special harvest menu. Sarah found herself seated between Thomas and Bill Cooper's wife Martha, with the Hendersons across from them. "I remember your grandfather's first harvest here," Martha said, passing Sarah a basket of rolls. "He was as nervous as you were today, but he had good instincts, just like you do." "Speaking of instincts," Mike called from the next table. "Heard you two got premium grade on that wheat. Those new irrigation lines paid off." Sarah felt Thomas's arm brush against hers as he reached for his coffee. "Sarah's the one who found her grandfather's old plans," he said. "She's got a real eye for improvement opportunities." "And a good teacher," Sarah added, giving Thomas a sideways glance that made Martha hide a smile behind her napkin. The conversation flowed easily, moving from crop yields to weather predictions to local gossip. Sarah realized she understood all of it now. The technical talk about moisture levels and market prices, the references to past seasons and shared experiences, the gentle ribbing between long-time neighbors. Somewhere along the line, she'd become part of this community's fabric. As the evening wound down, Thomas walked her to her truck. The summer night was warm and heavy with the scent of fresh-cut wheat, and crickets chirped in the darkness beyond the diner's lights. "Thank you," Sarah said suddenly, turning to face him. "For what?" She pulled the receipt from her pocket, smoothing it in her hands. "For believing I could do this. For teaching me. For—" She hesitated, then continued softly, "For making it. Our farm, not just my grandfather's." Thomas took a step closer, his expression serious in the dim light. "Sarah, But Mike's voice called from the diner doorway. "Hey, you two. Got a call from the weather service. Storm front moving in tomorrow. Might want to get those last few acres in before it hits." The moment broke, but something lingered in the air between them. Sarah carefully refolded the receipt. Their first joint sale, tangible proof of what they could accomplish together. As she climbed into her truck, she caught Thomas watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. Some harvests, she was beginning to understand, yielded more than just crops. Dark clouds gathered over Miller County, eerily similar to the night 1 year ago when Thomas had pulled Sarah from her sinking car. The weather service was calling for severe thunderstorms, possibly worse than last year's deluge. But this time they had more than just themselves to worry about. They had acres of freshly harvested wheat waiting to be moved to storage. "The grain trucks won't make it to the elevator before this hits," Thomas said, watching the approaching storm front. "We need to secure what we can here." Sarah was already moving, directing the farmhands they'd hired for harvest season toward the storage bins. She'd learned from last year's storm, insisting they invest in additional storage capacity for exactly this kind of emergency. Now that decision was about to pay off. The wind picked up as they worked, carrying the electric smell of approaching rain. A massive crack of thunder made everyone jump, and Sarah instinctively looked toward Carter Creek, where the water was already rising. "Hey!" Thomas's hand on her arm brought her back to the present. "We're not losing anything this time." She nodded, grateful for his understanding. Together, they coordinated the movement of grain and equipment, securing everything they could before the storm hit in earnest. The last truck had barely made it to the storage bins when the rain began. Fat, heavy drops that quickly became a torrential downpour. Sarah was checking the bin seals one final time when she saw it, a section of fence near the creek giving way under the force of wind and rushing water. Without thinking, she ran toward it, knowing that if it breached completely, the floodwater would have a clear path to their storage area. "Sarah!" Thomas's voice barely carried over the howling wind. He was running after her, understanding her intention as soon as he saw the failing fence. They reached it together, fighting against the wind to hold the posts upright. Rain plastered Sarah's hair to her face as she braced herself against the fence. Memories of another storm, another night, flooding back with the rising water. "We need support beams," she shouted. Thomas nodded, already turning toward the barn, when a massive crack split the air. A lightning bolt struck a tree near the creek, sending a massive branch crashing toward them. Thomas moved without thinking, pulling Sarah away from the fence just as the branch crashed down where she'd been standing. They tumbled together onto the muddy ground, his arms protective around her, both of them gasping from the near miss. For a moment, they just lay there, rain pouring down around them, hearts pounding from adrenaline and something else. Sarah found herself staring up at Thomas, suddenly acutely aware of how close they were, how his body sheltered hers from the rain. "This is familiar," she said softly, remembering the night he'd pulled her from her car. "Little different this time," he replied, his voice rough. "This time I know who I'm saving." "And who is that?" The words came out barely above a whisper. Thomas's hand came up to brush wet hair from her face, his touch lingering. "Someone who became everything I never knew I was looking for." The moment stretched between them, electric as the storm above. Then another crack of thunder broke the spell, and reality crashed back in with the rain. "The fence," Sarah gasped. Scrambling to her feet, they worked together in the downpour, using fallen branches and rope to brace the failing section. The old fence post, now cracked and weather-worn, would need to be replaced, but their makeshift repairs would hold until the storm passed. As they finally made their way back to the Harrison house, soaked and muddy but triumphant, Sarah paused to look at the damaged fence post. Like the one Thomas had helped her grandfather repair years ago, it stood as a marker of change, of challenges faced together. "You know," she said, catching Thomas's arm before he could head inside, "I never properly thanked you for that night." "Sarah, no, let me finish." She took a deep breath, rain still falling around them. "That night, you didn't just save my life, you showed me a different way to live it. And every day since then, you've been teaching me, supporting me, believing in me." She gestured to the fields around them, to all they'd built together. "This is so much more than I ever dreamed possible." Thomas stepped closer, his eyes intense. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. That land I wanted to buy, your grandfather's land, it stopped being about the land a long time ago. Then what is it about?" The rain was easing now, the storm beginning to pass. Thomas reached out, taking her hand in his. "It's about the person who made me see that some dreams are better when they're shared." Behind them, the damaged fence post stood as a testament to another storm weathered together, another challenge faced and overcome. But this time, as Thomas pulled Sarah closer, neither of them was thinking about the storm. They were too busy discovering that some things were worth getting caught in the rain for. The Chicago skyline glittered against the night sky, a constellation of artificial stars so different from the Nebraska darkness Sarah had grown accustomed to. From her old office on the 40th floor, the city spread out below her like a circuit board, all straight lines and geometric patterns. Nothing like the organic curves of farmland and creek beds she now thought of as home. "The board is very impressed with the development proposals," Marcus Chen, her former colleague, said as he spread the latest urban planning documents across her old desk. "Meridian's ready to move forward as soon as you give the word. They've even increased their offer after seeing the soil quality reports." Sarah ran her fingers over the glossy renderings. Modern apartments, upscale shopping, a sustainable urban community that would replace fields of wheat and corn. The projected revenue figures made her farming profits look almost quaint in comparison. "Sarah," Marcus prompted, "this is exactly the kind of project you used to dream about managing. Remember how excited you were about the Riverside development last year?" She did remember. The woman in those memories felt like a stranger now. Someone who measured success in square footage and profit margins, who had never known the satisfaction of bringing in a harvest or the pride of saving crops from drought. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Creeks rising again. Don't worry, got the Henderson boys helping with sandbags. Focus on your meetings." A smile tugged at her lips as she pictured him out there, probably covered in mud, protecting their land. Their land. When had she started thinking of it? That away. Earth to Sarah. Marcus waved a hand in front of her face. "Look, I know playing farmer was a nice break, but surely you're ready to come back to the real world now." "The real world?" Sarah stood up, walking to the window. "Do you know what I was doing this time last week, Marcus? I was helping deliver a calf in the middle of the night. When it was done, I sat in the barn and watched the sun rise over fields I'd helped plant and harvest. Tell me what's not real about that. But this opportunity is someone else's dream." Sarah turned back to him. "Not mine, not anymore." Later that evening in her old apartment, Sarah found herself staring at the development plans she'd brought home. The proposed buildings would erase every trace of her grandfather's work, of the legacy he'd built acre by acre. The creek where Thomas had saved her would be redirected into decorative fountains. The fields where they'd fought drought and celebrated harvest would become parking structures and retail space. Her phone rang, Thomas's ringtone. She answered on the first ring. "Creek secure," he said without preamble, though I might never. Get the mud out of these boots. Thank you, she said softly, for taking care of everything. A pause. Not everything. Place feels strange without you here. Sarah looked around her sleek apartment, at the urban views she'd once found so inspiring. Now they just felt empty. I know what you mean. How are the meetings going? She stared at the development plans. They want to build something new here, something modern and profitable and completely soulless. And what do you want? The question hung in the air between them, stretched across hundreds of miles of telephone wire. Sarah thought about her grandfather's journal, about Thomas teaching her to read the weather, about communities coming together during storms and celebrations shared over harvest dinners. I want to come home, she said simply. The word home felt right in a way her apartment, with its designer furniture and city views, never had. She could hear Thomas's smile in his voice when he responded. Then come home. I will. Tomorrow. She picked up the development plans, all their glossy promises suddenly meaningless. But first, I need to make some things clear to some people here. Want me to come get you? No, she said, thinking of the meetings scheduled for tomorrow. I need to do this myself, to close this chapter properly. After they hung up, Sarah walked to her floor-to-ceiling windows one last time. The city sparkled below, beautiful and distant as stars. But her mind was already back in Nebraska, where real stars filled the sky, and morning would find Thomas checking fence lines and grain moisture levels, his footprints in the dew-covered grass, marking a path she now knew she wanted to follow. She dropped the development plans into her shredder, watching as glossy images of an unlived future turned into confetti. Sometimes, she was learning, the biggest dreams came true in the smallest places. Sarah found the letter while cleaning out her grandfather's old desk, tucked inside a worn copy of the Farmer's Almanac. The envelope was addressed simply, "For Sarah, when she understands." Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, recognizing her grandfather's distinctive handwriting. Thomas found her an hour later, sitting on the study floor, surrounded by scattered papers, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "Sarah?" He knelt beside her, concern etching his features. "What's wrong?" She handed him the letter, her voice thick with emotion. He knew. Somehow he knew. Thomas began to read. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then something remarkable has happened. You've found your way home, not just to the farm, but to yourself. I've watched you grow up from afar, seeing how your parents steered you toward their vision of success. But I always saw something else in you, something that reminded me of myself at your age. You see, I wasn't born to farming either. I was a city boy, just like your father, with all the same dreams of tall buildings and bigger profits. But then I met your grandmother, and she showed me what real wealth looked like. In morning dew on wheat fields, in soil rich enough to grow dreams, in communities that measure success by the strength of their bonds rather than the size of their bank accounts. I'm leaving you the farm because I recognize in you the same hunger I once had, not for money or status, but for something real, something that matters. You might not know it yet, but farming isn't just about growing crops. It's about growing roots, growing relationships, growing into the person you were meant to be. I've made arrangements with Thomas Wheeler to help you if you choose this path. I've watched him work this land alongside me, seen how he understands its rhythms and respects its needs. He reminds me of myself when I first fell in love with farming, and with your grandmother. Some crops, Sarah, take time to reveal their true harvest. Whatever you decide, know that I trust your heart to recognize the real value of this legacy, even if it takes time. The land will wait for you, as it waited for me. All my love, Grandfather P.S. If Thomas is reading this too, and somehow I suspect he is, remember what I told you about patience and timing. The best things in life, like the best crops, can't be rushed. Thomas looked up from the letter to find Sarah watching him intently. He planned this, she said softly. All of it. The inheritance. You teaching me. Not all of it, Thomas replied, his voice rough. He couldn't have planned the storm that brought you here, or what happened after. Sarah rose, walking to the window that overlooked their fields, no longer separate properties in her mind, but one unified whole. The summer sunset painted the wheat in shades of gold and amber, a view her grandfather must have loved for decades. When I first came here, she said, I thought he'd left me land, but he left me so much more than that. He left me a chance to discover who I really am. Thomas joined her at the window, close enough that their shoulders touched. And who is that? She turned to face him, her grandfather's letter still clutched in her hands. Someone who finally understands what real value is. It's not in development deals or profit margins. It's in watching things grow, in building something that lasts, in finding someone who sees the same future you do. Thomas took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Your grandfather told me once that farming was about faith. In the land, in the future, in yourself. But he never told me it was also about falling in love. Maybe some lessons we had to learn on our own, Sarah said softly. The setting sun streamed through the window, illuminating the study where her grandfather had spent so many evenings planning crops and reading weather patterns. His presence seemed to fill the room, not with sadness but with approval, as if all his careful plans had finally come to fruit. Sarah carefully folded the letter, thinking of her grandfather's words about patience and timing, about crops that take time to reveal their true harvest. Looking at Thomas, she realized some harvests were worth every moment of waiting. He wrote that you remind him of himself, she said, when he first fell in love with farming and my grandmother. Thomas smiled, drawing her closer. Smart man, your grandfather. Yes, Sarah agreed, leaning into him as the sun painted their fields in evening gold. He knew exactly what he was growing here. The Meridian Development representatives arrived in 3 black SUVs, their crisp suits and polished shoes incongruous against the gravel driveway of the Harrison farm. Sarah watched them approach from the porch, where she'd been reading her grandfather's letter again for courage. Ms. Harrison, the lead developer Richard Maxwell extended his hand. I trust you've had time to review our final offer. I have. Sarah gestured to the porch chairs. Please, sit. Though I think you may have wasted a trip. Maxwell smiled, thinly opening his briefcase. Before you make any decisions, we've made some adjustments to our proposal. The board has authorized me to increase our offer by 30%. He laid out the new contracts, the numbers making Sarah's breath catch despite herself. It was more money than her family had ever dreamed of, even in their most ambitious Chicago dealings. Furthermore, Maxwell continued, we're prepared to offer you a position overseeing the entire development project. You'd be coming back to the kind of work you were trained for, Ms. Harrison, the kind of work you excel at. The screen door creaked, and Sarah felt Thomas's presence behind her chair. He'd insisted on being here for this meeting, though he'd promised to stay quiet unless she needed him. That's quite an offer, Sarah said carefully. But I don't think you understand what you're really asking me to sell. It's prime real estate, Ms. Harrison, perfect for our sustainable community concept. We'd even be willing to incorporate some agricultural elements, community gardens, perhaps a farmer's market space. A truck door slammed in the driveway. Through the morning haze, Sarah saw Mike's familiar figure emerging, followed by Bill, Cooper, and what looked like half the county's farming families. What's this? Maxwell frowned as more vehicles arrived. Sarah stood, surprised herself. I don't know, I didn't. We heard Meridian was making their final push today, Mike called out, striding up to the porch. He carried a thick folder under his arm. Thought you might want to see something before you make any decisions. The folder landed on the table between the development contracts. Inside was a petition, pages and pages of signatures and handwritten notes from throughout Miller County. Started this at the diner last week, Mike explained. Once folks heard Meridian was coming back, well, Turns out, people have some strong feelings about paving over the best farmland in the county. Sarah leafed through the pages, her vision blurring as she read the comments. Memories of her grandfather helping the Coopers during the drought of '98. Stories of Harrison wheat helping feed the county during hard times. Recent memories of her own, organizing the irrigation project, bringing in the harvest, becoming part of the community. "This is all very touching," Maxwell said, his corporate smile strained. "But sentiment doesn't change the economic reality. This development would bring jobs, tax revenue. We've got jobs," Bill Cooper cut in, "growing food, building community, following in the footsteps of people like James Harrison, who understood that some things are worth more than money." Sarah felt Thomas's hand on her shoulder, a quiet source of strength. She looked up at the gathered farmers, her neighbors now, her friends. They'd come not just to support her, but to protect something they all believed in. "Mr. Maxwell," she said, standing to face the developers. "When I first inherited this land, I might have signed your contract without a second thought, but my grandfather left me more than acres and buildings. He left me a legacy of understanding what really matters." She picked up the contracts and handed them back. "I appreciate your offer, but this land isn't for sale, not at any price." "You're making a mistake," Maxwell warned. "This kind of opportunity is not an opportunity at all," Sarah finished firmly. "It's a sacrifice. One I'm not willing to make." The developers left as they'd arrived, in a cloud of gravel dust. But Sarah hardly noticed their departure, surrounded, now by neighbors offering hugs and handshakes. Someone suggested celebrating at the diner, and soon a procession of trucks was heading toward town. Before joining them, Sarah paused on the porch, looking out over the fields she'd chosen over millions of dollars. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked softly, coming to stand beside her. She reached for his hand, thinking of her grandfather's letter, of growing roots and recognizing real value. "Only that it took me so long to understand what I really wanted." "And what's that?" Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. "This, all of this, a life that's rich in all the ways that matter." From the driveway, Mike called out, "Hey, you two coming? Marie's making her special harvest apple pie." Hand in hand, they walked toward their waiting friends, leaving the development contracts forgotten on the porch. Some choices, Sarah realized, weren't really choices at all. They were just moments of finally accepting what your heart had known all along. The Meridian Development representatives arrived in 3 black SUVs, their crisp suits and polished shoes incongruous against the gravel driveway of the Harrison farm. Sarah watched them approach from the porch, where she'd been reading her grandfather's letter again for courage. Ms. Harrison, the lead developer, Richard Maxwell, extended his hand. "I trust you've had time to review our final offer." "I have." Sarah gestured to the porch chairs. "Please, sit, though I think you may have wasted a trip." And Maxwell smiled thinly, opening his briefcase. "Before you make any decisions, we've made some adjustments to our proposal. The board has authorized me to increase our offer by 30%. He laid out the new contracts, the numbers making Sarah's breath catch despite herself. It was more money than her family had ever dreamed of, even in their most ambitious Chicago dealings. "Furthermore," Maxwell continued, "we're prepared to offer you a position overseeing the entire development project. You'd be coming back to the kind of work you were trained for, Ms. Harrison, the kind of work you excel at." The screen door creaked, and Sarah felt Thomas's presence behind her chair. He'd insisted on being here for this meeting, though he'd promised to stay quiet unless she needed him. "That's quite an offer," Sarah said carefully, "but I don't think you understand what you're really asking me to sell." "It's prime real estate, Ms. Harrison, perfect for our sustainable community concept. We'd even be willing to incorporate some agricultural elements, community gardens, perhaps a farmer's market space." A truck door slammed in the driveway. Through the morning haze, Sarah saw Mike's familiar figure emerging, followed by Bill, Cooper, and what looked like half the county's farming families. "What's this?" Maxwell frowned as more vehicles arrived. Sarah stood, surprised herself. I don't know. I didn't. We heard Meridian was making their final push today, Mike called, out, striding up to the porch. He carried a thick folder under his arm. Thought you might want to see something before you make any decisions. The folder landed on the table between the development contracts. Inside was a petition, pages and pages of signatures and handwritten. Notes from throughout Miller County. Started this at the diner last week, Mike explained. Once folks heard Meridian was coming back, well, turns out people have some strong feelings about paving over the best farmland in the county. Sarah leafed through the pages, her vision blurring as she read the comments. Memories of her grandfather helping the Coopers during the drought of '98. Stories of Harrison wheat helping feed the county during hard times. Recent memories of her own, organizing the irrigation project, bringing in the harvest, becoming part of the community. This is all very touching, Maxwell said, his corporate smile strained. But sentiment doesn't change the economic reality. This development would bring jobs, tax revenue. We've got jobs, Bill Cooper cut in. Growing food, building community, following in the footsteps of people like James Harrison, who understood that some things are worth more than money. Sarah felt Thomas's hand on her shoulder, a quiet source of strength. She looked up at the gathered farmers, her neighbors now, her friends. They'd come not just to support her, but to protect something they all believed in. Mr. Maxwell, she said, standing to face the developers. When I first inherited this land, I might have signed your contract without a second thought, but my grandfather left me more than acres and buildings. He left me a legacy of understanding what really matters. She picked up the contracts and handed them back. I appreciate your offer, but this land isn't for sale, not at any price. You're making a mistake, Maxwell warned. This kind of opportunity is not an opportunity at all. Sarah finished firmly. It's a sacrifice, one I'm not willing to make. The developers left as they'd arrived, in a cloud of gravel dust. But Sarah hardly noticed their departure, surrounded, now by neighbors offering hugs and handshakes. Someone suggested celebrating at the diner, and soon a procession of trucks was heading toward town. Before joining them, Sarah paused on the porch, looking out over the field she'd chosen over millions of dollars. Any regrets? Thomas asked softly, coming to stand beside her. She reached for his hand, thinking of her grandfather's letter, of growing roots and recognizing real value. Only that it took me so long to understand what I really wanted. And what's that? Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. This, all of this, a life that's rich in all the ways that matter. From the driveway, Mike called out, "Hey, you two coming? Marie's making her special harvest apple pie." Hand in hand, they walked toward their waiting friends, leaving the development contracts forgotten on the porch. Some choices, Sarah realized, weren't really choices at all. They were just moments of finally accepting what your heart had known all along. The winter wind whistled around the corners of the Harrison farmhouse as Sarah and Thomas spread the renovation plans across the kitchen table. Outside, snow blanketed their fields, giving the land a season of rest. But inside, their dreams were taking new shape on paper. The East Wing needs the most work, Sarah said, tracing the old blueprints with her finger. But if we open up these walls, we could create a proper master suite while preserving grandfather's study. Thomas nodded, adding notes to their growing list of improvements. The house that had sheltered 3 generations of Harrisons was about to embrace a new chapter, much like they were. What about this space? He pointed to a section of the first floor. Your mother might appreciate a proper guest room when she visits. Sarah looked up, surprised. You're thinking about Mom's visits? Well, he smiled, she is going to be my mother-in-law. Might as well start planning for peace treaties early. The reminder of their recent engagement made Sarah's heart flutter. The simple ring on her finger caught the winter sunlight streaming through the window. A family heirloom that had belonged to Thomas's grandmother, offered with hands that had trembled despite their usual strength. The sound of cars on the gravel driveway interrupted their planning. Sarah's parents had driven in from Chicago for the weekend, and Thomas's family was coming over for dinner, their first gathering since announcing their engagement. "Ready for this?" Thomas asked, squeezing her hand. "They'll have to be ready." "And for us," Sarah replied with determination. Her mother swept in first, bringing a gust of cold air and designer perfume. But instead of her usual critical glance around the farmhouse, she paused, taking in the renovation plans with genuine interest. "Sarah, darling, are these the changes you mentioned?" She moved closer to study the blueprints. "The flow from the kitchen to the dining room makes much more sense this way." Thomas's parents arrived next, his mother carrying her famous apple pie, his father's weathered face creased in a warm smile. They'd welcomed Sarah like a daughter from the moment Thomas had announced their engagement, recognizing in her the same love for the land that ran in their family's blood. "Hope you're keeping my boy in line," Thomas's father said, giving Sarah a gentle hug. "He's stubborn as a mule when it comes to trying new farming techniques." "Actually," Sarah grinned, "he's been surprisingly open to my ideas about organic rotation crops." "That's because your ideas make sense," Thomas called from where he was helping his mother in the kitchen. Most of them, anyway. Even Sarah's father seemed different tonight, less focused on his phone, more present in the moment. He studied the renovation plans with his business acumen, but his suggestions were thoughtful rather than critical. "You're preserving the original architecture while modernizing the functionality," he noted. "Smart. It's like what you two are doing with the farm, honoring tradition while embracing innovation." Sarah felt Thomas's arm slip around her waist, and she leaned into him, watching their families merge as naturally as their farms had. Her mother was sharing recipes with Thomas's. Their fathers were deep in discussion about sustainable farming practices, and the warmth in the room had nothing to do with the crackling fireplace. Later, after dinner had been cleared and their families had left, Sarah and Thomas stood on the porch despite the cold, looking out over their snow-covered fields. The renovation plans lay forgotten inside, but their promise remained. A home expanded and strengthened, ready for the future they would build together. "Think we can really make all these changes by spring?" Sarah asked, pulling Thomas's coat. "Or tighter around them both? The house or the families?" "Both." He kissed her temple, his breath warm against the winter air. "We already have. Your father asked me about crop futures today. Actually listened when I explained our organic initiative. And my mom's already planning to teach you her secret pie crust recipe." Sarah laughed. "The highest honor. Besides," Thomas continued, "we've done harder things. Built something real here, something lasting. The house is just details." She turned in his arms to face him, seeing in his eyes the same certainty she felt in her heart. "When did you get so wise about these things? Must be all those farming metaphors rubbing off on me. Growth, patience, nurturing things." He smiled. "Or maybe I just finally found the right partner to grow with." Above them, winter stars sparkled. In a clear Nebraska sky, their light touching the fields where spring would bring new growth, new challenges, new dreams to nurture together. The renovation plans might give their house a fresh start, but their hearts had already found their forever home. Spring arrived in Nebraska with the gentle persistence of new growth pushing through thawing soil. Sarah stood at the edge of their newly unified fields, watching the sunrise paint the morning mist in shades of gold. Behind her, the renovated farmhouse stood proud against the dawn sky, its fresh paint and restored features a testament to the winter's work. The paperwork had come through yesterday, a new deed combining the Wheeler and Harrison farms into a single entity. She pulled the document from her jacket pocket, still pristine in its official envelope. They hadn't opened it yet, wanting to share the moment together. "Thought I'd find you out here," Thomas called, approaching with their morning coffees. "Some things never change, but some things do," she replied, holding up the envelope. "Ready? They sat on the tailgate of her truck, shoulders touching as Sarah carefully broke the seal. The deed was straightforward in its legal language, but the words Wheeler Harrison Agricultural Trust at the top made her throat tight with emotion. "Your grandfather would be proud," Thomas said softly, his finger tracing their joined names. "This is what he hoped for, I think. Not just the land being preserved, but being made stronger." Sarah leaned against him, remembering the past years. "Journey, remember when all you wanted was to buy this land from me? Seems like a lifetime ago." He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Got something better instead." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their moment. Mike's truck led a small procession down the farm road, the community arriving for their spring planting celebration. It was an old tradition in Miller County, gathering to help neighboring farms start the season right. But this year felt different, special. "There's the happy landowners," Mike called out as people began unloading food, drinks, and supplies. "Got your planting plan ready?" Sarah patted the folder beside her. "Color-coded and everything?" "She's got us all organized within an inch of our lives," Thomas added with pride. "Even got my father using spreadsheets for crop rotation." The morning unfolded like a well-choreographed dance, with teams spreading out across their combined acreage. Sarah watched from the central organizing station as Thomas demonstrated their new organic seeding technique to a group of neighboring farmers. His patience in teaching reminded her of how he'd taught her back when she couldn't tell wheat from corn. "Quite a change from last spring," Martha Cooper said, bringing Sarah a plate of her famous cinnamon rolls. "When you first came, some folks wondered if you'd last a month." "Sometimes I wondered that myself," Sarah admitted. "But the land, it gets in your blood, doesn't it?" "That it does. Though I suspect it wasn't just the land that kept you here." Martha's knowing smile made Sarah blush. By midday, the celebration was in full swing. Tables laden with potluck dishes stretched across the yard, and the sound of laughter mixed with serious discussions about weather patterns and market prices. Sarah found herself moving easily between conversations about organic certification, requirements, and reminiscences about her grandfather's famous crop-saving techniques. "Sarah!" Thomas called from near the barn. "Got something to show you." He led her inside, where their new sign was waiting to be hung. Wheeler Harrison Farms Growing Legacy carved in warm wood. They'd designed it together during the winter. Evenings, combining elements from both families' farming histories. "Think it's time to make it official?" he asked, lifting the sign. "More than time." Together, they carried it out to the main gate. The community gathered to watch as they mounted it, cheers and applause breaking out when it was secure. Sarah felt Thomas's hand find hers, squeezing gently. The afternoon sun warmed the fresh earth as planting continued. Sarah worked alongside Martha and the Henderson women, while Thomas and Mike coordinated the machinery operations. Every so often their eyes would meet across the fields, sharing silent understanding of how far they'd come. As evening approached, the community gathered, one last time for Marie's traditional blessing of the fields, a custom as old as farming in Miller County. But this year she added something new. "May these combined lands," she said, her voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "be blessed with the strength of two families' wisdom, the joy of new beginnings, and the promise of dreams grown together in good soil." Later, after everyone had gone and twilight painted their fields in soft purple, Sarah and Thomas stood by their new sign. The deed in her pocket felt like a promise made real, a future mapped out in acres and love. "You know," she said, "when people ask how we met, he pulled me out of a flood. Sounds a bit dramatic." Thomas laughed, pulling her close. "Would you prefer she inherited the land I wanted, so I had to marry her? How about we grew something better than either of us imagined?" Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, witnesses to another season of growth beginning on land that had seen generations of dreams take root and flourish. The wedding invitations arrived on a warm June morning, exactly 1 year after the storm that had changed everything. Sarah traced her fingers over the embossed design, delicate wheat stalks framing the text, with a small illustration of the Harrison farmhouse in the background. At the bottom, tiny raindrops bordered the date, a subtle reminder of how their story began. "They're perfect," Thomas said, coming in from his morning rounds. He picked one up, smiling at the words Wheeler Harrison Farms, elegantly printed beneath their names. "Though I still say we could have just announced it at Mike's diner. Would have reached everyone just as fast." "My mother would never have forgiven us," Sarah laughed. "She's already compromising on having the wedding here at the farm." The renovated farmhouse had been transformed over the past year. The east wing now held their master suite, while her grandfather's study remained unchanged, a sanctuary of memories and wisdom. The enlarged kitchen opened onto a new deck overlooking their fields, where they would soon exchange vows under the Nebraska sky. Sarah walked to the window, where the morning sun illuminated their thriving crops. "Hard to believe it's been a year since you pulled me out of that flood. Best rescue I ever made," Thomas said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Though you ended up saving me right back." "Oh? How's that?" "Saved me from thinking the land was all that mattered. Showed me there were bigger dreams worth growing." A horn honked outside, Mike's truck pulling up with Martha Cooper and Marie from the diner. The women had appointed themselves unofficial wedding planners, bringing the whole community together to help prepare for the celebration. "Sarah, honey," Martha called out, "we've brought fabric samples for the tablecloths. And my special recipe book," Marie added. "Time to finalize that menu." Thomas pressed a quick kiss to Sarah's temple. "That's my cue to make myself scarce. Bill Cooper mentioned something about needing help with his irrigation system." "Coward," Sarah teased, but she was smiling as she went to meet her friends. The morning passed in a whirl of wedding preparations, but Sarah's mind kept drifting to the journey that had brought them here. She thought of her first desperate days on the farm, how lost she'd felt, how Thomas had taught her to read the land and weather, his patience never wavering as she learned, how the community had embraced her, helping her find her place in their world. By afternoon, she needed a break from wedding discussions. Excusing herself, she walked out to Carter Creek, where it all began. The water flowed peacefully now, giving no hint of its fury that stormy night. A new fence lined its banks, the one she and Thomas had built together during last year's second storm, when they'd finally admitted their feelings. "Thought I might find you here," Thomas's voice came from behind her. "You okay?" "Just thinking," she said as he joined her, "about all the different ways this could have gone. If you hadn't been there that night, if I'd sold the land to developers, if I'd gone back to Chicago. But you didn't." "No," she smiled, taking his hand. "I found something better. Found myself, really." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the creek flow. In the distance, their wheat fields swayed in the summer breeze, healthy and strong. The renovated farmhouse rose behind them, and beyond it, the new sign marked their unified property. "Got something for you?" Thomas said finally, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "Found it this morning while moving some of your grandfather's old files." Inside was a photograph she'd never seen, her grandfather and grandmother on their own wedding day, standing proud in front of the same farmhouse. On the back, in her grandfather's familiar handwriting, "The best crops are grown in love's soil." Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she turned to Thomas. He knew, didn't he? Somehow, he knew exactly what would happen. He knew you had it in you to love this land like he did. The rest, Thomas smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek. That was just good farming luck. A dinner bell rang from the house, Marie calling everyone in to continue wedding preparations. Sarah tucked the photo carefully into their wedding invitation, a piece of past blessing their future. "Ready to go back?" Thomas asked. Sarah looked around at their land, no longer just fields and crops, but the foundation of their shared dreams. She thought of the storm that had brought her here, of all the growth and change that had followed, of the love that had taken root and flourished in this soil. "Yes," she said, taking his hand. "I'm ready." Together they walked back toward the farmhouse, where their friends waited to help plan their celebration. Above them, the Nebraska sky stretched endless and blue, promising new seasons, new challenges, new joys to harvest. Their story had begun in a storm, but it would continue in sunshine, growing stronger with each passing season, rooted in the rich soil of love, tradition, and dreams grown together.